The dense, shadowy expanse of the Black Forest in Germany has always carried a sense of mystery, a place where the ancient whispers of the past seem to come alive. Its towering trees, their branches knotted in eerie silence, seem to obscure the secrets buried deep within the soil. For centuries, travelers have spoken of the ominous feeling that clings to the air, as though the forest itself is watching, waiting. Yet, among the myths and legends that swirl around this place, one tale stands out, not because of its supernatural elements, but because of the raw, tragic, and deeply human story it tells. It is the story of a family whose bloodline ended, not through fate or disease, but through a chilling decision made in the darkest corners of time. The inbred bloodline that ended on purpose. A decision so final, so deliberate, that it raises unsettling questions about the fragility of legacy and the cost of survival. In 1726, deep in the heart of the Black Forest, a family found themselves trapped in a cycle that had no escape. Their ancestors had come from a time when bloodlines were revered, preserved, and passed down through generations. Yet, in the 18th century, this particular family seemed to be cursed from the very beginning. With every new generation, the shadows of the past loomed ever larger. Physical deformities, mental instability, and strange behaviors plagued them. What was once a symbol of power and influence slowly turned into something dark, twisted, and, perhaps, unholy. As the generations passed, it became clearer, there was something terribly wrong. Their blood was not pure, and with each passing year, the signs became more impossible to ignore. But the real question that remains, even centuries later, is why? Why would anyone, especially those who had inherited so much wealth and influence, willingly end their own bloodline? This wasn't the slow, inevitable decline caused by disease or poor fortune. No, this was a conscious, deliberate decision. A choice to close the door on their own legacy, to end a family line that stretched back for generations. It seems almost unfathomable that such a drastic measure would be taken, and yet, here it was, a family reaching its breaking point in the most final way imaginable. The peculiarities surrounding their decision have become a haunting mystery for historians, scholars, and even the locals of the surrounding towns. The family's tragic story has been passed down through generations, whispered about in hushed tones among those who know the true details. Some speak of a curse, a dark force that had followed the family for centuries. Others argue that it was the inevitable result of inbreeding, a tragic consequence of the family's repeated and unlawful marriage practices, handed down through the ages. The records are scant, but the rumors are plentiful. In the end, what remains most striking is the decision to end it all. The family chose, deliberately, not to continue. They chose to close the chapter of their history in the most extreme way possible. And the rest of the world, who remained blissfully unaware of their plight, could only watch as the bloodline was erased forever. It's easy to imagine the tension that must have been present within the family. They were well aware of their fate. With each new birth, the family became more and more consumed by their own history. The genetic deformities became harder to ignore. Mental instability and physical maladies, passed down from one generation to the next, began to define them. And yet, there was no escape. Their isolation in the Black Forest only magnified their suffering, as they became increasingly disconnected from the rest of the world. The outside world, with its burgeoning modernity, was foreign to them. They were trapped in their own twisted world of fear, shame, and inevitability. They could not escape their legacy. The choices made in the past loomed like a curse that they could not break free from. And so, the decision was made. The family would cease to exist. No more children. No more heirs. The legacy of this bloodline would end here, in the heart of the Black Forest, buried beneath the ancient trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many others. But this wasn't a decision made lightly, nor was it made out of some misguided sense of pride. It was born out of a deep, almost tragic understanding of what their existence had become. Their bloodline, once full of promise, had become a twisted mirror of its former self, reflecting back only pain, isolation, and a deep-seated fear of what might come next. In the years that followed, this family's story faded into the realm of legend. The details of their lives were buried, left to rot in the archives of forgotten history. But the Black Forest, in all its quiet, haunting beauty, still remembers. There are those who claim to have seen the faintest traces of the family's ghostly legacy still lingering in the woods, perhaps a shadow moving through the trees, or an eerie whisper in the wind. There are still those who recall the peculiar family that once lived in isolation, their strange behavior and unsettling presence serving as a warning to those who would venture too deep into the forest. Today, the story of the family that ended their own bloodline remains a mystery, a dark chapter in history that still begs for answers. What drove them to make such a horrifying choice? Was it fear, despair, or something far darker, something perhaps not of this world? The Black Forest, with its dense trees and shrouded paths, may never fully give up its secrets. But one thing is clear, the family's legacy was not one of greatness or heroism, but of tragedy, of a bloodline that, in the end, chose to extinguish itself in the face of an unrelenting curse. It is a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, of how even the most powerful families can be undone by forces beyond their control. As we peer into the past, trying to unravel the mysteries of this family's downfall, we are left with more questions than answers. The story of this bloodline that ended on purpose forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, our capacity for self-destruction, our fear of what lies in our own blood, and the lengths we will go to escape the legacy of the past. And though we may never fully understand why they made the choices they did, one thing remains certain: the family's tragic tale will forever echo in the haunted corridors of the Black Forest, a place where time itself seems to stand still, waiting for the past to reveal its secrets. The Black Forest, with its ancient trees and winding, shadow-filled paths, has always been more than just a geographical location. It is a place of myth and legend, where the past lingers in the air like a thick fog, refusing to be forgotten. Located in southwestern Germany, this dense, dark forest stretches across over 6,000 square miles, a vast expanse of towering firs and pines, interspersed with small villages and hamlets that seem almost lost in time. The forest itself has long been a symbol of the eerie and the unknown, a boundary between the mundane world and the mysterious, a place where the veil between the living and the supernatural seems unnervingly thin. For centuries, travelers and locals alike have whispered of strange occurrences, bizarre sightings, and unexplainable events that have left an indelible mark on the region's history. But in the early 18th century, the Black Forest was more than just a landscape of folklore and fear. It was a realm that held within it the remnants of ancient European traditions, where old superstitions still held sway and the power of the church, the state, and local nobility shaped the lives of those who dwelled within its shadow. Life in the forest was difficult, isolated, and unforgiving. The terrain was rugged, the winters long and harsh, and the people who lived here often found themselves separated from the rest of the world by a thick canopy of trees that seemed to trap them in a time of their own making. The forest itself had a reputation for being a place where one could easily get lost, both physically and spiritually. Those who ventured too deep into its heart risked disappearing without a trace, swallowed by the forest's relentless growth and the ancient magic that seemed to seep from every corner. This was the world in which the family, whose tragic fate would later become legend, found themselves. Living in relative isolation, removed from the bustling cities and villages that dotted the countryside, they were a product of a time when the old ways still held sway. The Black Forest, in all its grim beauty, served as both their home and their prison. For the family, it was both a sanctuary and a curse. Their isolation allowed them to retreat from the pressures of the outside world, but it also meant that they were trapped in a web of tradition, superstition, and genetic history that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The belief systems of the time, entrenched in a combination of Christian doctrine and ancient pagan customs, played a significant role in shaping the family's life and choices. The 18th century was a time of tremendous change across Europe, but the Black Forest, remote and rural, remained a place where the past held sway with an almost suffocating grip. In many ways, the people who lived here were caught between two worlds: the old, superstitious ways that had defined their ancestors for centuries, and the emerging rationalism of the Enlightenment that was sweeping through Europe. The town surrounding the Black Forest was steeped in religious dogma, with the Catholic Church still holding significant influence over every aspect of life. It wasn't uncommon for locals to believe in the supernatural, to see omens and signs in the world around them. The forest itself, with its ancient trees and deep shadows, was often seen as a place of danger, a threshold between the living and the dead. Stories of witches, spirits, and dark rituals were common among the local villagers, and it wasn't hard to see why. The isolation of the forest and the harsh conditions of life there led many to turn to their faith, clinging to the belief that the supernatural forces around them could either save them or destroy them. Amidst this backdrop of superstition, the family's story unfolded. It wasn't just the physical isolation of the forest that made their lives so peculiar, but the genetic isolation that had begun to define them. Inbreeding, once considered a common practice among the isolated and rural communities, had slowly worked its way into their bloodline. Over generations, the family's intermarriage created a web of genetic defects, physical deformities, and mental illnesses that would only worsen with time. These maladies became more and more apparent as the family grew, and the signs of decay spread throughout the generations. Yet, despite the mounting evidence that something was terribly wrong, the family seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to break free from the cycle they had inherited. The isolation of the forest, coupled with the closed nature of their bloodline, created a world where their twisted fate could unfold with little interference from the outside world. In this environment, where isolation reigned and old beliefs held sway, the family's tragic descent seemed almost inevitable. The harsh conditions of life in the Black Forest left little room for external intervention. The family was left to grapple with their fate alone, with only the whispers of the past to guide them. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of their declining health and genetic deformities, there was little anyone could do. The very isolation that had shielded them from the outside world now kept them trapped in their own nightmare, unable to escape the consequences of their choices. The village folk, who lived on the outskirts of the Black Forest, were often aware of the family's peculiarities, but they kept their distance, for fear of angering forces beyond their understanding. The family, with their strange behavior and deteriorating physical condition, were regarded with a mixture of pity and fear. Some said they were cursed, that the blood that flowed through their veins was tainted, while others believed that the family had brought their misfortune upon themselves through their own choices. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same: a family caught in a cycle of genetic decay, unable to break free from their fate. As the 18th century wore on, the whispers of the family's plight grew louder. Rumors spread about their increasingly strange behavior, their growing isolation, and their refusal to interact with the outside world. The family, once wealthy and influential, was now a shadow of its former self, living in squalor and silence. The forest, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. The family had become trapped in a self-made hell, their bloodline tainted, their future sealed by the very isolation that had once shielded them. For all their isolation, the family could not escape the consequences of their actions. The Black Forest, with its ancient trees and dark secrets, had borne witness to their fall from grace, and its twisted paths seemed to hold the key to their tragic fate. The forest, in all its dark beauty, would forever be a symbol of their isolation, their downfall, and the eerie forces that had guided them to their tragic end. And as the centuries passed, the story of this cursed bloodline would become yet another ghost story whispered in the shadows of the Black Forest, a tale of tragedy, isolation, and a family that had sealed their own fate. The family at the center of this haunting story was far from ordinary. They were born of old blood, with a lineage that could trace its roots back to a time when the Black Forest was a cradle for power, wealth, and influence. Their ancestors were once revered, respected landowners, respected traders, and respected members of the community. However, as time went on, the family became more of a shadow of its former self, marked by isolation, decline, and eventually, tragedy. Their once prominent name had faded into the obscurity of the forest, and by the early 18th century, they were known for little more than their bizarre behavior and unsettling circumstances. There was something eerily unremarkable about the family. On the surface, they appeared as any other struggling noble line that had seen better days. But beneath the surface, something was very wrong. The family's descent into obscurity was not caused by any one single event, but rather a gradual accumulation of misfortune, peculiar choices, and, eventually, biological calamity. The first signs of trouble were subtle. A generation or two before the family reached its tragic end, whispers began to surface among the people of the nearby village. Those who were close enough to witness the family's activities saw strange behaviors. A man who seemed to rarely leave his home, always locked behind the walls of his estate. A woman, once admired for her beauty, who had become disfigured and increasingly erratic in her behavior. The village elders muttered about these oddities, some even going so far as to say the family had been cursed by the forest itself. Yet, there was no clear explanation for the unsettling shifts in their lives. As each new generation of the family came into the world, their behaviors and traits became more pronounced, more impossible to ignore. The genetic mutations caused by repeated inbreeding began to show themselves in the form of deformities, both physical and mental. Children were born with twisted limbs, cleft palates, and deep, vacant eyes. Some suffered from epilepsy, others from an unsettling detachment from reality. Even those who seemed physically normal were often tormented by strange compulsions, behavioral disorders, and erratic actions that left the rest of the village in fear and wonder. These children, often kept hidden away from the public eye, became known not by their names but by the horrific rumors that surrounded their family. The family's own attempts to explain their unusual circumstances were often contradictory and odd. They had no clear understanding of genetics or heredity, but they seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation nonetheless. The inbreeding that had plagued their lineage for generations was now a well-established, albeit deeply entrenched, way of life. Some members of the family believed they were simply victims of fate, trapped in a cycle that they had no power to break. Others, however, grew more paranoid as the years wore on. The mental instability that had slowly taken hold of some members of the family became a force of its own. There were accusations of madness, suspicion of witchcraft, and rumors of sinister rituals being carried out deep in the forest. At the core of this unraveling family was the patriarch, a man of great pride and ambition, who was determined to maintain the family's legacy no matter the cost. For a time, he tried to maintain appearances, hiding the worst of the family's secrets and attempting to run his household like a noble estate. But the mounting pressure, the ever-growing list of deformities and mental illnesses among his offspring, eventually took its toll. As the years passed, he became more reclusive, retreating further into the isolation of the Black Forest. The family's wealth, once abundant, began to diminish, and the once esteemed name became more synonymous with decay and misfortune. The patriarch, whose will was once ironclad, began to crumble under the weight of his failures, both personal and familial. The matriarch, on the other hand, was a far more mysterious figure, largely unknown to those outside the family. She seemed to move in the background, maintaining an eerie quietness, yet her presence was felt in every corner of the household. It was rumored that she had been involved in the family's strange practices, that she had a hand in keeping the family's secrets, and that she had been a driving force behind some of the darker aspects of their behavior. While the patriarch attempted to preserve the family's external appearance, the matriarch seemed more interested in the family's internal preservation, a preservation that involved ensuring that the family's bloodline was kept within their walls, even as it slowly deteriorated. It was the children, however, who would bear the most significant marks of this legacy. Each new generation seemed to carry with it the burden of the last, unable to escape the genetic flaws that had been passed down through generations of isolation. The younger members of the family were often kept in seclusion, hidden away from the prying eyes of the outside world. Their lives were shrouded in secrecy, and few knew the true extent of their suffering. The physical deformities and psychological disorders only grew worse with time, each child born weaker than the last. There were rumors of unnatural births, of stillborn children, and of babies that lived only for a few days before passing away, cursed by the very blood they carried. The family's most tragic element, however, was not the grotesque physical changes that marked them but the mental strain that was passed down through the generations. As the family's bloodline thinned and became more fragile, so too did their minds. What had started as a quiet eccentricity in the first few generations of the family eventually bloomed into full-blown insanity in the later generations. The eldest son of the patriarch, a young man once praised for his intelligence and wit, was rumored to have suffered a complete mental breakdown, isolated from the world and terrified of leaving the family estate. His younger siblings were no better, each one slowly unraveling under the weight of the family's legacy. Some became paranoid, convinced they were being watched by invisible forces. Others became obsessed with rituals, convinced they could somehow reverse the effects of the curse that had gripped them. The family's self-imposed isolation in the Black Forest only magnified their mental deterioration. The villagers' whispers about the family grew louder, but the family remained hidden, in complete denial of the reality around them. The patriarch's pride kept him from seeking outside help, and his desire to protect the family name kept him from acknowledging the deepening crisis. In the meantime, the younger members of the family fell deeper into despair, either driven mad by their genetic inheritance or resigned to a life of sickness and deformity. The family became an unrecognizable shadow of its former self, its once proud name now associated only with tragedy, secrecy, and fear. In a sense, the family had become prisoners of their own bloodline, unable to break free from the genetic chains that bound them. Each generation was forced to carry the weight of its predecessor's mistakes, and each new member of the family was born with the knowledge that they would one day have to bear the burden themselves. There was no escape from this vicious cycle, no way out of the shadows that had consumed them. Their legacy was one of horror, isolation, and slow decay, a family trapped within the walls of the Black Forest, doomed by the very blood they carried. Inbreeding, a practice once common among isolated communities, is a dark thread woven into the tragic tapestry of this family's history. While it was not uncommon for families to marry within their own circles in the 18th century, the extreme level of inbreeding in this particular bloodline was not merely a result of tradition or necessity, but a deep-seated choice to preserve their lineage at any cost. The consequences of this decision, however, were catastrophic. The family's isolation in the Black Forest only exacerbated the effects, as their limited contact with the outside world left them unaware of the advancing understanding of genetics and heredity. What they didn't know, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that by keeping the bloodline closed and pure, they were condemning themselves to a future of physical and mental degeneration that would ultimately seal their fate. In the beginning, the family may have seen their actions as a way to maintain the purity of their bloodline. Marriage within their own circle, they likely believed, would keep their wealth and influence contained, preserving the power and resources they had accumulated over generations. However, as the years passed, this seemingly benign act began to take a darker turn. The accumulation of genetic defects began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, the deformities were small, easily overlooked by those who were too close to the family to see the danger. But as each new generation came into being, the signs became more difficult to ignore. Children began to be born with strange physical abnormalities, such as malformed limbs, cleft palates, and disfigured facial features. These deformities, however, were merely the visible symptoms of a far deeper problem. Behind the scenes, the family's bloodline had become a breeding ground for mental instability, physical weakness, and an array of debilitating diseases that had been passed down through the generations. As the decades wore on, the family's once thriving estate became a reflection of their internal decay. What had once been a proud, prosperous home was now filled with broken bodies and damaged minds. The patriarch, who had once been a powerful and charismatic figure, became increasingly withdrawn, retreating further into the shadows of his own mind. The matriarch, a woman who had once been known for her beauty and grace, now moved through the halls of the estate like a ghost, her once pristine appearance now marred by the ravages of time and disease. The children, once full of promise, were reduced to husks of their former selves, their bodies plagued by deformities and their minds consumed by madness. It was as if the family had become trapped in a nightmarish cycle, each generation bearing the burden of the last, each new birth a reminder of the twisted legacy they could never escape. The consequences of inbreeding are far more than just physical deformities. They extend into the realms of psychology and mental health as well. Inbreeding increases the likelihood of recessive genetic disorders, many of which affect the brain and nervous system. This often leads to a host of mental health issues, from learning disabilities to severe psychiatric disorders. In the case of this family, the effects of inbreeding were devastating. Over the course of several generations, the mental stability of the family members began to deteriorate. Some became paranoid, unable to trust even those closest to them. Others experienced severe mood swings, alternating between fits of manic energy and deep depressive episodes. There were reports of extreme violence, of family members attacking each other in fits of rage, or retreating into complete isolation, unable to function in society. As the family grew more and more isolated, their grip on reality began to slip further, and the line between the real and the imagined blurred into one incomprehensible nightmare. For those who were unlucky enough to be born into this broken family, life was a cruel and unforgiving experience. The children, born into a world of darkness and madness, had little hope of escaping the genetic fate that had been thrust upon them. Their deformities were not only physical but psychological, and the constant reminder of their family's twisted history weighed heavily on their young minds. It is said that the children of this family rarely left the confines of the family estate. They were hidden from the outside world, left to grow up in a world defined by secrecy, isolation, and fear. The eldest son, once considered the heir to the family's legacy, became a shell of a man, consumed by paranoia and fear. His mind, warped by the inbreeding that had shaped his very being, refused to let him leave the estate. He would often wander the halls of the house, muttering to himself, convinced that he was being watched by invisible forces. His younger siblings fared no better. Some were born with physical deformities that made them grotesque by any standard, while others suffered from mental illnesses that left them incapable of interacting with the outside world. What was perhaps most tragic about this family's plight was their inability to see the cause of their suffering. They clung to the belief that they were the victims of a curse, or that they were being punished for some sin committed by their ancestors. The idea that their fate was a direct result of their own choices, specifically, their decision to continue the practice of inbreeding, was a truth too painful to accept. They could not break free from the cycle, and perhaps, deep down, they did not want to. The family's refusal to acknowledge the root cause of their suffering only prolonged the agony. They continued to marry within their own bloodline, further solidifying their fate. Each new birth was another step down the path of destruction, another generation doomed to live in the shadows of their own making. As the years passed, the family situation grew more dire. Their wealth dwindled, their estate fell into disrepair, and their name became synonymous with decay. The villagers, who had once respected the family, now whispered about them in hushed tones, fearful of the curse that seemed to hang over the estate like a dark cloud. The family had become a relic of the past, a tragic reminder of the dangers of isolation and inbreeding. They had once been a powerful force in the region, but now they were nothing more than a faded memory, a footnote in the history of the Black Forest. The tragic consequences of inbreeding were never more evident than in the final generation of the family. These last descendants, who had inherited the full brunt of the genetic decay caused by their forebears, were left with no hope of recovery. They were physically and mentally broken, their minds ravaged by the very blood that ran through their veins. Some sought solace in religious rituals, believing that their suffering was a punishment from the divine. Others turned to darker, more twisted practices, convinced that they could somehow reverse the curse that had been placed upon them. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter what rituals they performed or how deep into the forest they ventured, there was no escape. The family was trapped, condemned to live out their days in the very prison they had built for themselves. In the end, the family's legacy was one of tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of inbreeding and the catastrophic consequences of isolation. Their story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of genetic purity, and the toll it can take on the human body and mind. The family's refusal to break free from the cycle of inbreeding sealed their fate. Their once proud name became synonymous with madness and deformity, and their bloodline ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Their legacy, now buried deep in the heart of the Black Forest, remains a silent testament to the devastating effects of a family trapped in the grip of its own twisted history. The death of the family's patriarch marked a turning point in the history of this already fractured lineage. He had once been the head of a proud family, a man who held the reins of a decaying legacy with a grip that seemed unshakable, yet his demise revealed the fragility of everything he had tried so hard to maintain. In his final days, the patriarch was a shadow of his former self, a man who had long since given up on trying to salvage the remnants of his family's wealth and reputation. His decline was not just physical, but emotional and mental, a slow unraveling that mirrored the slow collapse of his bloodline. His death was a catalyst, an event that set the stage for the tragic final chapter of the family story. The circumstances surrounding his death were, as one might expect, shrouded in mystery and suspicion. In a family already so steeped in secrets, the patriarch's passing seemed to fit perfectly with the cryptic and tragic narrative of his life. Some believed that his death was the result of a natural decline, a consequence of age and the unrelenting toll that time had taken on his fragile body. Others, however, suspected foul play, either an act of malice from within the family or an accident brought about by the worsening instability of his mental state. The most dramatic theory, however, was that his death was not a mere consequence of time or illness, but a final, deliberate act of self-destruction, a way for the patriarch to escape the crippling weight of the family's curse, or perhaps a merciful release from the burden of continuing a bloodline that had already destroyed itself. The family, already fractured by inbreeding and disease, was thrown into further disarray following his death. The patriarch had been the last vestige of stability in a family on the brink of collapse, and with his passing, all semblance of order vanished. The estate, once an emblem of the family's power and influence, became a hollow shell, haunted not just by the ghosts of those who had passed but by the unspoken truths that lingered in every corner. The younger members of the family, already struggling with their own deteriorating health and mental states, found themselves unable to handle the practical and emotional aftermath of their father's death. They were ill-prepared to manage the family's affairs, and worse still, they were now fully aware of the inevitable fate that awaited them. At the time of his death, there were only a few surviving family members left to inherit whatever was left of the once great estate. Most were far too young or too incapacitated to take up the mantle of leadership, and those who could were simply too broken to do so. His only surviving son, the one who might have carried on the family name, was an unstable and paranoid young man, unable to function outside the confines of the family estate. His mind, already damaged by years of inbreeding, had fractured under the weight of his inheritance, and he seemed consumed by an ever-growing fear of something lurking just beyond his grasp. Some said he was haunted by the ghosts of his ancestors, others that he believed the very land upon which he lived was cursed. Regardless of the cause, it was clear that the son was incapable of stepping into his father's shoes. The matriarch, too, was a figure in decline. A woman whose once imposing presence had commanded respect, she now moved through the estate like a ghost, a shadow of the woman she had once been. Her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she barely spoke, and when she did, it was often in a way that made little sense to those around her. She had become reclusive, hiding away from the world in the same way her husband had before his death. The house itself, which had once been filled with life, now stood empty and hollow, its halls echoing with the sound of long-forgotten footsteps. The family's fortune, which had once been vast, was rapidly depleting, and what little remained was squandered on the whims of those who had no concept of how to manage wealth. The patriarch's death left behind a family that was, in every sense of the word, broken. They were like a house of cards, teetering on the brink of collapse, unable to hold themselves together for much longer. The inheritance, which had once seemed like a guarantee, now felt like a burden, a millstone around the neck of the surviving members. Without the patriarch's guidance, the family fell further into despair, their already precarious situation worsened by the weight of their own genetic legacy. The family was not only physically and mentally broken, but it had also lost its last connection to the world beyond the forest. They were now fully isolated, not just from society, but from their own past. In the weeks and months following the patriarch's death, the family's remaining members became more and more withdrawn. The youngest generation, whose deformities and mental illnesses had been a source of shame for so long, now lived in complete isolation. They were hidden away from the world, kept locked in their decaying family estate, as if the outside world had forgotten about them altogether. Their only company was each other, and the whispered rumors that circulated about the family's tragic past. These remaining family members, once wealthy and influential, now lived in a kind of twilight existence, drifting from one day to the next, clinging to the remnants of a legacy that had long since faded. Meanwhile, the outside world moved on. The villagers who had once been both fascinated and frightened by the family's existence slowly began to forget about them. They spoke of the family in hushed tones, as if the very mention of their name was enough to invoke the curse that seemed to hang over them. But the family's story, much like the family itself, faded into the shadows of history. The family's estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, was left to decay, its walls crumbling and its grounds overrun by weeds. No one came to claim it, and eventually, it became little more than a forgotten relic of a time long past. Yet, for all the tragedy and confusion that surrounded his death, the patriarch's passing marked the beginning of the end for the bloodline. It was as if, in his death, the final nail was driven into the coffin of a family that had long since been doomed. There was no longer any hope of redemption, no possibility of recovery. The family had reached its breaking point, and it was a point from which there was no return. In the years following his death, the Black Forest, with its dense trees and haunting stillness, would come to reclaim the remnants of the family's legacy. The land, once the home to a proud lineage, would become little more than a place of ruin and mystery. The patriarch, once the unchallenged head of the family, had finally been laid to rest, but the questions surrounding his death and the fate of his family would remain unanswered for centuries. His passing marked the final act in a tragic drama, one that had been unfolding for generations. The family had, in the end, been consumed by the very legacy they had sought to preserve. Their story, dark and tragic, would live on only in the whispers of the forest, where the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echoes of a family that had vanished into the darkness, never to return. The family's final days were marked by a growing sense of desperation, as though they could feel the weight of their doomed legacy pressing down on them from all sides. They had long since lost any semblance of the power and influence they once held, and now only the echoes of their former selves remained. In the wake of the patriarch's death, the family was left with no guiding force, no one to steer them through the chaos of their deteriorating condition. With their minds unraveling, their bodies deteriorating, and their wealth exhausted, they found themselves increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Their once grand estate, now a decaying husk, seemed to reflect the disintegration of everything they had known. It was a place of silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that rattled through the trees of the surrounding forest. The house, which had once been a symbol of their grandeur, had become little more than a prison. Its walls, once adorned with fine tapestries and portraits of long-forgotten ancestors, now stood bare and weathered, as if even the house itself had lost the will to remember. The halls, once bustling with servants and visitors, were now eerily quiet. The family's few remaining servants, most of them aged and frail themselves, had long since abandoned their posts. There was no one left to care for the estate, and it seemed that the land itself had begun to reclaim what was once its own. Vines crept up the sides of the crumbling mansion, and the gardens, once carefully tended, had become a wild tangle of overgrown plants. The family was now surrounded by nature's relentless encroachment, as though the very earth was conspiring to erase their presence from the world. The family's isolation, both physical and emotional, seemed to reach its peak in these final years. The surviving members, once proud and defiant, had retreated into themselves. The mental illnesses that had plagued them for generations now dominated their lives. The youngest generation, whose deformities and afflictions had made them outcasts even within the family, were now confined to their rooms, hidden away from the outside world. It was said that some of them had not left the estate in years, unable to face the reality of their condition. They had become prisoners in their own home, trapped by the same bloodline that had brought them into being. The air in the house was thick with the stench of decay, not just in the walls and furniture, but in the very lives of those who still lived there. The family's remaining interactions with the outside world were few and far between. The nearby villagers, who had once spoken in hushed tones about the family's cursed bloodline, now ignored them altogether. Some claimed that they had seen figures moving through the windows of the mansion, but they never ventured close enough to confirm their suspicions. The family had become little more than a dark rumor, a faded memory of a time when they had been feared and respected. The villagers had long since turned their attention to more pressing matters, leaving the family to rot in the obscurity of their own madness. However, there were still those who spoke of the family in whispers, though not with the same reverence they had once commanded. Instead, there was a sense of sadness, a recognition that something tragic had unfolded within the walls of the crumbling estate. Some believed that the family had been cursed by the forest, that their bloodline had been doomed from the start. Others speculated that the family's isolation had caused them to lose touch with reality, their minds warped by years of living in a self-imposed prison. Yet, no one knew for certain what had happened to them, and no one dared to find out. The Black Forest, with its endless depths and shadowy paths, seemed to have swallowed the family whole, and the world had moved on. As the years passed, the family's decline became more pronounced. The remaining members were now little more than ghosts of their former selves, fading into the mists of history. Their once proud bloodline had withered away, and the legacy they had so desperately tried to preserve had been lost to time. The family's name, once spoken with a mix of awe and fear, was now forgotten, relegated to the margins of history. There was no one left to carry on their story, no one to speak for them or remember their once greatness. They had become, in the end, a tragic footnote in the history of the Black Forest, their existence swallowed by the very land they had once ruled over. Yet, despite their disappearance from the world, the story of their decline lingered. It haunted the edges of the forest, like a faint whisper on the wind. There were those who claimed to have seen the remnants of their mansion, the broken walls rising out of the forest like a monument to their downfall. Others spoke of hearing strange noises in the night, of footsteps echoing through the trees, though no one ever ventured close enough to investigate. The family's curse, if such a thing truly existed, seemed to live on, woven into the fabric of the forest itself. And in the hearts of those who still remembered, the mystery of what had happened to them endured. For those who dared to study the family's tragic history, the question of why the bloodline had ended so abruptly remained at the forefront. What had driven them to destroy themselves, to choose extinction over survival? Was it the result of their own misguided attempts to preserve their name, or had some deeper force been at work? Had they truly been cursed, or had their own actions brought about their downfall? These questions, left unanswered, have continued to haunt historians, scholars, and storytellers alike. The answers may never come, and perhaps, in a sense, that is what makes the story of this family so haunting. It is not just their physical decline that is tragic, but the fact that their fate is shrouded in mystery, a puzzle that no one can solve. The family's estate, now abandoned and overgrown, stands as a silent testament to their fall. It is a place where time seems to stand still, where the past is preserved in a state of eerie stillness. The mansion, with its broken windows and crumbling walls, serves as a monument to a family that once had everything, only to lose it all in the most tragic way imaginable. The forest, with its dark, tangled trees, has reclaimed what was once its own, and the family's name is now little more than a fading memory, a whisper on the wind. But the story of this cursed family does not end with their disappearance. It continues to echo through the halls of their once great home, through the whispers of the forest, and through the lingering questions of those who still wonder what went so horribly wrong. The family's tale, dark and tragic, is one of isolation, madness, and the irreversible consequences of a bloodline consumed by its own history. It serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of secrecy, of the isolation that can come from trying to preserve something that was never meant to be preserved, and of the terrible cost of decisions made out of fear and desperation. The family may be gone, but their legacy, marked by tragedy and mystery, remains woven into the very fabric of the Black Forest itself. The family's story, tragic as it was, seemed to come to an end with the crumbling of their estate and the silent fading away of their bloodline, but the Black Forest has a way of holding onto secrets. Even after the last of the family disappeared into the shadows of history, whispers about their fate persisted. Though the house had long since decayed and the surrounding land was left to the wild growth of the forest, there were still those who spoke of the family in hushed tones, often with a sense of both reverence and fear. It wasn't just the villagers who spoke of them, but also wandering travelers who, over the years, would find their way into the eerie stillness of the forest and tell stories of their strange encounters. One of the most common tales that circulated about the family's final days involved the haunting presence that some claimed to have felt near the family estate. The mansion, although abandoned, had a strange aura about it, a sense that it was still inhabited, not by the living, but by something else, something lingering. Some who ventured too close to the ruins reported hearing strange sounds emanating from within the house, muffled whispers, the soft creak of floors that no longer supported weight. Others spoke of an oppressive feeling that would settle over them when they ventured near, as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. The deeper into the forest they traveled, the more intense the sensation became, as though the very trees themselves were closing in, pushing them back. It is said that there was a local man, a woodcutter, who had once worked on the outskirts of the family's estate. He had heard the rumors of the cursed bloodline and the family's tragic fate, but being a practical man, he never gave much thought to such superstitions. One evening, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity, he decided to venture into the woods and investigate the old mansion. As he approached, he described the air as thick with an unnatural stillness, the usual rustling of leaves and sounds of wildlife completely absent. When he reached the mansion, the front door was hanging slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. He stepped over the threshold, but the moment he did, a cold chill washed over him, and the silence deepened. He claimed to hear footsteps echoing from the upper floors, though no one was there. Panicked, he turned to leave but found the door had slammed shut behind him. For hours, he wandered the halls of the decaying mansion, hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, feeling the press of unseen hands at his back, guiding him deeper into the house. By the time he managed to escape, he was trembling, his face ashen, and his story only deepened the mystery surrounding the house. The villagers dismissed him as a fool, but those who had known the family, who had heard the legends of their descent into madness, could not help but wonder if the family's curse had somehow been passed on, not just to their bloodline, but to the very land they had inhabited. Over the years, similar accounts from travelers trickled in. Some said that they saw shadows moving in the windows, others felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A few spoke of disturbing dreams in which they were visited by figures, some familiar and some unfamiliar, who begged them to help end the suffering that had been perpetuated within the house. There were stories of lost wanderers, people who had ventured too deep into the Black Forest and never returned, their bodies later discovered on the outskirts of the forest, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Many of these disappearances were eventually chalked up to the perils of the forest itself, the treacherous terrain, the lack of proper guidance, the risk of getting lost in its dense, disorienting woods. But there were still those who believed the family's ghostly presence had played a role in these strange events, their spirits still lingering, unwilling to let go of the tragedy that had defined their existence. One story, in particular, stood out. A young couple, having heard the rumors about the haunted estate, decided to spend a night there, hoping to prove that the tales were merely superstitions. Armed with nothing more than their courage and a few provisions, they made their way into the heart of the forest. When they arrived, the mansion seemed almost welcoming, as though it had been waiting for them. They made camp near the front steps and settled in for the night. The forest, however, was not as silent as it had been in the past. Strange noises seemed to come from all directions, distant thumps, the sound of something scratching against the walls, and eerie, unintelligible whispers that filled the air. As the night wore on, the couple grew uneasy, and eventually, one of them could no longer ignore the sense that they were being watched. Looking around, the man saw a figure standing in one of the broken windows of the mansion. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure appeared to be staring directly at him. His heart pounding, he rushed towards the house, but by the time he reached the door, the figure had vanished. The young woman stayed behind, not wanting to enter the mansion, but the man, driven by an unexplainable compulsion, pushed open the door and stepped inside. He had no intention of going far, but once inside, the house seemed to pull him in, as though something inside was calling him. His companion, unwilling to leave him behind, followed. They ventured deeper into the house, through corridors and rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and as they moved further into the estate, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't long before they were separated, each finding themselves lost in different parts of the house. The man, frantic, searched for her, calling out her name, but it was as if the very air had swallowed her voice. After what felt like hours, he found her in a room at the back of the house, standing motionless, staring at a portrait on the wall. The face in the painting was that of the last matriarch of the family, her eyes dark and hollow, as though they were looking directly into the depths of the man's soul. When the woman spoke, her voice was low and unnerving, as if it had come from a place far deeper than the mansion itself. She murmured that they had to leave, that the house would not let them go. Her expression was blank, her mind far from the present moment. The couple managed to escape the mansion by the breaking of dawn, but both were forever changed. The man spoke little of the experience afterward, but his eyes always held a deep, unspoken terror whenever the forest was mentioned. His companion, likewise, could never speak of that night without a tremor in her voice. The stories of the mansion and its haunting continued to spread, becoming a fixture of the local lore. Some still claimed to have heard whispers on the wind when passing through the forest at night, and a few who ventured too close to the estate claimed to feel a sudden, unnatural chill, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. The Black Forest, it seemed, had swallowed the family's legacy, but not their presence. It had absorbed their suffering, their madness, and their torment, and these echoes lingered in the air, in the trees, and in the walls of the old house. Whether these were true hauntings or merely the imagination of those who ventured too far into the darkness, no one could say for certain. What remained was the chilling fact that the family's legacy, their curse, lived on in the whispered stories, in the eerie sensations felt by those who dared to wander too close. The Black Forest, with its ancient trees and hidden paths, had become the final resting place of a bloodline consumed by its own history, and the story of their downfall would continue to be told, long after they had disappeared from the world. The fading of the family's legacy did not mark the true end of their influence in the Black Forest. Though the bloodline had been extinguished, their story, deeply woven into the fabric of the forest's dark history, continued to linger like a shadow. It is often said that some histories are never truly forgotten, even when the people who lived them are. The remnants of the family's once proud name were scattered like whispers, haunting not only the decaying mansion but also the very landscape around it. The forest itself, with its dense, mist-covered trees, had become a living testament to the family's cursed existence. And as with many such dark tales, there were those who believed that the family's tragic downfall had left a lasting imprint on the land itself. Some villagers, particularly those who had lived in the area for generations, spoke of an unnatural shift in the forest's behavior after the family's passing. It wasn't just the mansion that had crumbled into ruin. The forest surrounding it, too, seemed to take on a different character. The trees, once silent observers, began to grow in twisted and gnarled shapes, their branches reaching toward the sky in unnatural ways. Where once sunlight could break through the thick canopy to touch the earth, the forest now seemed perpetually shrouded in a heavy, oppressive gloom. The ground, once rich and fertile, grew overgrown and barren, as if the land itself had absorbed the sorrow and madness of those who had once lived there. Strange occurrences began to take place in the village and the surrounding areas, further feeding the already widespread rumors. Travelers, particularly those who dared to make their way through the dense thicket of the Black Forest, reported feeling a sense of unease as they neared the mansion's ruins. It was as if they were crossing into a place where time itself had slowed, where reality felt thinner, and the ordinary rules of nature no longer applied. People spoke of inexplicable cold spots, of trees that seemed to shift positions when they weren't looking, of eerie lights flickering in the distance, and sounds that seemed impossible to trace. Some claimed to have seen figures, tall, shadowy forms, standing just beyond the reach of their vision, vanishing the moment they tried to focus on them. There were also reports of strange animal behavior near the mansion. Birds that once had populated the area in large numbers, filling the air with their calls, had disappeared. In their place, crows, ravens, and other dark-feathered creatures appeared in unsettling numbers, perching on the trees surrounding the estate. The locals, who had once found solace in the sounds of nature, now found the cawing of these birds to be a constant, unnerving presence. The animals, too, seemed to avoid the mansion itself, circling the air above it but never landing. The once thriving wildlife of the Black Forest appeared to recognize the area as a cursed zone, a place to be avoided at all costs. The mansion itself, though largely abandoned, still called to those with an insatiable curiosity or a taste for the occult. As time passed, small groups of thrill-seekers and amateur ghost hunters began to make the trek to the ruins, hoping to uncover something, a relic, a hidden treasure, or, perhaps, an answer to the lingering mystery. But no one who went there returned unchanged. Those who ventured too close, particularly at night, spoke of feeling as though they were being drawn into the house's depths, as though the very building itself was alive, feeding on their energy, pulling them in. One such group, a collection of university students researching local folklore, arrived in the Black Forest determined to uncover the truth behind the family's downfall. They were skeptical of the more dramatic rumors, curses, ghosts, and other supernatural phenomena, and thought of themselves as rational individuals interested only in historical documentation. But upon arriving at the estate, they found themselves ensnared by the very legends they had come to study. The night they spent there is often described by those who were with them as one of creeping unease. As the students set up their equipment, recording devices, and cameras aimed at the dark corners of the estate, they felt an unmistakable shift in the air. It began subtly. The sounds of the forest seemed to quiet, and the wind, which had been rustling the leaves only moments before, fell dead still. The temperature dropped noticeably, a chill settling in that didn't feel natural. One of the students, drawn by an unexplained impulse, wandered off into the mansion alone, drawn to the upper floors. The others, sensing something was wrong, followed cautiously, but they were too late. When they found him, he was standing in front of a dusty old portrait of the last matriarch of the family, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He couldn't explain what he had seen, but his words, barely coherent, spoke of a sensation that could not be rationalized. He described seeing a figure in the painting move, not physically, but in the way it seemed to shift its gaze. He claimed that the woman's eyes followed him, locking onto his every movement as though the portrait was aware of his presence. He wasn't the only one who felt it. The group, shaken and terrified, quickly packed up and left, but none of them could shake the lingering sense that something unseen had followed them out of the forest. The next day, the group left the area entirely, and they never spoke about what had happened at the mansion again. Some members went on to write about their experience, but in vague terms, as if the memory itself was too unsettling to confront in any detail. The few that dared to speak openly about it were met with skepticism, as the legends of the cursed family seemed to be little more than the stuff of campfire stories. Yet the fact remained, no one who had ventured into that house had ever left unscathed, and the rumors persisted that the Black Forest had claimed yet another victim. Beyond the unsettling experiences of those who dared to enter the mansion, the larger question remained: what had happened to the family? What had driven them to such a tragic end? And why did the forest seem to hold on to the memory of their existence so tenaciously? Was the land truly cursed, or was it the family's own actions, their secrecy, their isolation, their descent into madness, that had poisoned the very soil they once owned? Theories ranged from the practical to the supernatural. Some believed that the family had simply been victims of their own isolation, that the intense inbreeding had caused mental and physical deterioration so profound that it drove them to madness. Others, however, suggested that the forest itself had some deeper power, a malevolent force that had taken hold of the family, using their bloodline's weaknesses to destroy them. There were even rumors of ancient, forgotten rituals, witchcraft practiced in secret, or pacts made with dark forces, that had led to the family's downfall. Yet, perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that the family's demise had been inevitable, an organic result of their own choices. In a twisted way, they had sealed their fate by remaining locked within the Black Forest, refusing to leave or seek help. The curse, if it could be called that, was a consequence of their insular existence, a reminder of the dangers of isolation, inbreeding, and the weight of past sins left unaddressed. As time went on, the house itself was swallowed by nature. The mansion, once imposing and regal, was slowly consumed by vines, its walls crumbling under the weight of neglect. The family's estate faded from view, and the Black Forest continued to grow, as if erasing the last vestiges of a cursed history. But for those who had lived through the stories, for those who had felt the strange energy of the forest, the family story was never truly forgotten. It lived on in whispers, in the cold winds that howled through the trees, and in the deep, shadowy spaces of the forest, a haunting reminder that some legacies, no matter how tragic, are never truly left behind. The passing of the family did not mark the end of the eerie phenomena that seemed to haunt the remnants of their legacy. In fact, over time, the curse that had plagued them began to weave itself into the very fabric of the Black Forest. The mansion, though now a decaying shell of its former self, still stood as a silent sentinel over the forest, its ruins growing steadily more entwined with the surrounding wilderness. The broken windows, long since shattered by time and neglect, allowed only shadows and moonlight to creep through, casting eerie reflections across the crumbling walls. And still, people who ventured too close to the estate spoke of strange occurrences, of feelings of being watched, of sudden chills that would descend without warning, and of inexplicable, haunting sounds that seemed to emerge from the very structure itself. But perhaps what was most unnerving were the stories of those who had attempted to explore the ruins in the years following the family's departure. The few who returned spoke of experiences so strange and unsettling that they could scarcely put them into words. One such individual was a historian who had heard the stories of the family's downfall, intrigued by the idea of uncovering lost documents or artifacts that might shed light on their tragic history. He arrived at the mansion alone, determined to unravel the mystery that had become a part of the region's folklore. At first, the historian's visit seemed like nothing more than an ordinary investigation. Armed with his notebook, a lantern, and a sense of intellectual curiosity, he stepped inside the house. The floor creaked under his weight, and the air inside was thick with dust, but there was nothing to suggest anything supernatural at first. He began to explore the rooms, carefully cataloguing the state of decay. Some of the furniture had rotted away completely, leaving only the barest traces of former luxury. Faded portraits hung on the walls, their faces obscured by time, while remnants of expensive tapestries hung loosely from the rafters. It wasn't until he reached the upper floor, where the family's most private chambers had once been, that the historian began to feel a shift. The air grew colder, and a thick, oppressive silence settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right, that there was more to the house than simply the remnants of a wealthy, isolated family. As he moved through the hallways, the feeling of being followed became overwhelming. He glanced over his shoulder constantly, but there was no one there. He chalked it up to his imagination, until he reached what appeared to be the master bedroom. The room was unlike the others. While most of the estate had succumbed to time and neglect, the master bedroom had been eerily preserved, as if untouched by the years. The bed, though decrepit, was still made, the sheets and blankets carefully folded, as though the family had simply stepped away for a moment.